The most crushing victory in medieval history was forged not with strength, but with weakness. On the morning of October 25th, 1415, an English army devastated by dysentery, starving and cornered, gazed across a sodden field at an ocean of French banners waving with arrogance. They had nowhere to run. The only path home lay directly through a force 5 times their superior, armored in the finest steel of Europe and thirsty for their annihilation. They were the remnants of a failed invasion, a wounded serpent crawling towards its lair, only to find itself face to face with the hunter. For these men, battle was not a matter of glory or conquest, but of simple, brutal survival. Every breath was a challenge to fate, every glance at the horizon a confirmation of their imminent end. Opposite them, the flower of French chivalry prepared not for a battle, but for a bloody coronation. They were a tide of iron and silk, an avalanche of nobles confident that their charge was as unstoppable as the rising sun. They saw the English not as an army, but as prey already vanquished, a group of sick peasants whose only purpose was to serve as trophies in their triumphal march. Underestimation was a poison that ran through their veins, blinding them to the reality of the ground they stood upon and the character of the king they faced. Victory, for them, was a formality, an inevitable conclusion dictated by numbers, lineage, and the weight of steel. They failed to realize that their greatest strength was about to become their mortal anchor in a sea of mud. But history is rarely written by certainties. Henry V's victory at Agincourt was a perfect storm of tactical genius and enemy arrogance, an immortal lesson that in war, the board is as important as the pieces. It was not simply the Welsh longbow that won the battle, but the masterful way in which a desperate king turned the battlefield itself into his primary weapon. Henry V used a muddy, narrow terrain to completely nullify French numerical superiority, transforming his enemy's greatest strength, their invincible armored knights, into their fatal weakness. He served them up on a platter as immobile, exhausted targets for the most lethal and precise shower of arrows the medieval world had ever witnessed, a downpour of steel that would rewrite the rules of war forever. At the head of the English army stood a figure forged in the brutal border wars of Wales, King Henry V, young, at barely 28, but with the gaze of a hardened veteran. His ambition had led him to the shores of France to claim a throne he considered his by birthright. Now, however, that ambition had been reduced to the raw necessity of survival. Trapped and outnumbered, his charismatic leadership was the only glue holding his sick and demoralized army together. While the French nobles mocked from a distance, Henry V projected a calm that was itself a weapon, a steel-like resolve that ran through the ranks, promising not an easy victory, but a glorious death or a return home against all odds. He was a king betting everything on a single, desperate roll of the dice. His army was a reflection of his precarious situation, a handful of souls against a host. Of his roughly 8,000 men, the backbone was not the noble knights, but 6,000 longbowmen, many of them Welsh, common men turned into the most lethal instruments of war of their time. The remainder, barely 2,000 men-at-arms, formed a solid but insufficient core. Worse still, dysentery, the bloody flux, was an invisible enemy emptying them from within, leaving them weak and gaunt. Their motivation was no longer the conquest of France. That dream had drowned in forced marches and disease. Now, their only cause was survival, the visceral desire to see the shores of England again, a goal that seemed almost unattainable. Opposite them, the French command was a viper's nest of pride and rivalry, led nominally by the Constable of France, Charles d'Albret, and Marshal Boucicaut. The true power lay with a council of high-born dukes and counts, each more eager than the last to claim the glory of crushing the invaders. Their mindset was one of monumental arrogance. They saw Henry's army not as a threat, but as an insult, a collection of peasants and commoners who dared to challenge the most powerful nation in Christendom. Victory was not a possibility, it was a divine right. This absolute certainty blinded them, causing them to dismiss reports on the lethality of the archers and warnings about the state of the terrain. The battle, for them, was already won. This confidence was based on the magnificent and overwhelming force they had assembled, an army that some chronicles raise as high as 35,000 men. It was a true avalanche of iron, the embodiment of feudal might. The vast majority were men-at-arms and knights. Encased from head to toe in the most advanced and heavy plate armor, a defense almost impenetrable to the weapons of the era. Their strong point, their only conceivable tactic, was the massed charge of heavy cavalry, a shockwave designed to pulverize any infantry line. Their fatal flaw, however, was a direct consequence of this strength, a blind, unshakable faith that this charge was unstoppable under any circumstances. They completely ignored how their chosen battlefield would nullify their mobility, turning their invincible armor into a deadly weight. The game board was a death trap, disguised as a plowed field. Situated between the dense woods of Agincourt and Tramecourt, the terrain was Henry the Fire's tactical masterpiece. It was a narrow corridor, a natural bottleneck that prevented the French from deploying their vast numerical superiority and executing any flanking maneuvers. The field thus became a central character in the drama, a silent but implacable ally of the English. To worsen the situation for the French, a torrential rain had lashed the region the night before, transforming the freshly plowed earth into a deep, sticky quagmire, a veritable swamp that clung to every boot and every hoof. For a knight encased in 50 pounds of steel, each step would become an agonizing struggle against the ground itself, a Herculean effort that would leave him breathless before even reaching the enemy. Henry V not only chose his ground, he armed it with lethal cunning. He deployed his few men-at-arms in a compact central block, an anchor of steel in the coming storm. On his flanks, he positioned his thousands of Welsh archers, not in a straight line, but in wedge formations, angled to create devastating fields of crossfire that would turn the center of the field into a killing zone. And then, he gave the most brilliant and inspired order of the day, one born of desperation. He commanded each archer to plant before him a wooden stake, nearly 6 feet long and sharpened at both ends. It was an improvised anti-cavalry fence, a wall of wooden teeth waiting to be baptized in blood. The stage was set, the trap was laid. To not miss how hell is unleashed and a handful of desperate men defy an empire, subscribe to the channel and give it a like, because you are about to witness the anatomy of a massacre. For hours, only silence reigned over the field of Agincourt, a tense silence, heavy with the weight of thousands of destinies. The two armies watched each other like mythological predators, motionless under a gray, leaden sky. For the French, it was a pause of arrogant anticipation, a moment to savor the imminent destruction of their enemies. For the English, it was a test of discipline and nerve, a silent oath made by each man to stand firm until the end. Henry V walked the line, not with grand speeches, but with a resolute gaze and quiet words, forging a brotherhood of steel in his men. He knew that inaction favored the enemy, that the morale of his starving army was a finite resource. The wait had to end, and it would have to be him who broke it. Then, shattering the impasse with an audacity that chilled the blood of his own captains, Henry V gave the most unexpected order: advance banners. The English army, as a single organism, tore their stakes from the ground and advanced in unison. It was not a charge, but a deliberate, defiant march towards the enemy, closing the distance until their longbows were at optimal, deadly range. They stopped, a wall of defiant men amidst the mud, and hammered their stakes back into the earth, a gesture that was both a defense and a declaration. Here we fight. Here we die. The trap would not wait for its prey. The trap had moved to embrace it. This provocation was an insult the proud French nobility could not ignore. The response was a roar of fury. The first English volley was the spark that lit the prairie fire. 6,000 archers drew their yew-bows in unison, and at the cry of "loose," the sky darkened. It was not a rain. It was a hurricane of 60,000 arrows in the first minute, a swarm of hardened steel bodkin points that descended with a terrifying whistle. The arrows pierced weaker armor and found gaps in the strongest, felling men and, crucially, maddening the horses of the front line. The impact was devastating not only physically, but psychologically. French arrogance instantly transformed into blind rage. Without waiting for orders, disorganized and fragmented, the first wave of mounted French cavalry spurred their steeds and charged headlong into hell. The charge, which was meant to be the manifestation of French might, became a tragic parody. The magnificent war horses, bedecked and armored, lost all momentum the moment they set foot on the main battlefield. The mud, deep and voracious, clung to their legs, turning a thundering gallop into a clumsy, exhausting slog. Each stride was a desperate struggle, and the once unstoppable avalanche of steel slowed to a funeral procession. The riders, frustrated, spurred their mounts, sinking them even deeper into the mire, while the second and third volleys of Welsh arrows fell upon them with relentless precision, turning the noblest knights of France into almost static targets, helpless before the storm they had provoked. When the exhausted vanguard finally reached the killing zone, it met the nightmare of the stakes. The horses, already panicked by arrow wounds, impaled themselves on the sharpened wood, their shrieks of agony tearing through the air. Knights were thrown from their saddles directly into the mud, where the weight of their own armor became their coffin. Unable to rise quickly, they were easy prey for more arrows or for the finishing blows of the English infantry. The charge disintegrated into a chaos of fallen men, disemboweled horses, and twisted steel. The first and most feared weapon of the French army had not only been neutralized but had been turned into an obstacle for its own army. The disaster was absolute, and its consequence, fatal. The failed charge did not simply stop. It created a grotesque wall of bodies and dying animals, directly in the path of the main French force advancing on foot. What should have been an open battlefield became a labyrinth of death. The French men-at-arms, who formed the heart of their army, were now forced to navigate around the bodies of their own countrymen, breaking their formation and slowing their advance even further. Henry V's genius had not only stopped the charge, but had used it to disorder and channel the next enemy wave, preparing it for the next phase of the massacre. The French plan was in tatters before their main force had even struck a single blow. Now it was the turn of the heart of the French army, thousands of men-at-arms advancing on foot, a tide of steel that outnumbered the English at least 3-1, but their advance was an agony. Each step was a victory against the knee-deep mud, an effort that stole their breath and burned their muscles. The weight of their full-plate armor, normally their greatest advantage, became a torture. Harassed ceaselessly by the arrows that continued to rain down on them from the flanks, they reached the English lines not as a fresh and powerful shock force, but as a mass of utterly exhausted and gasping and disordered men, barely able to lift their weapons. When they finally clashed, the impact was surprisingly weak. The English men-at-arms, in lighter armor and standing on relatively firm ground, met the onslaught with disciplined ferocity. The French numerical superiority became irrelevant on the narrow battlefront. They could present as many men as the English, but theirs were on the verge of physical collapse. The fight became a brutal, close-quarters slugfest. The French push stalled, their energy drained by the mud and the incessant rain of arrows. The English line bent, but it did not break. It became a dike of steel holding back a dying tide. And then, the moment that sealed France's fate occurred. The Welsh archers, having emptied their quivers, dropped their great yew bows. But they did not retreat. They drew axes, warhammers, falchions, and long knives. And with a savage cry, they abandoned the protection of their stakes and charged into the flanks of the helpless mass of French men-at-arms. They were light men, unburdened by heavy armor, moving with agility through the mud that paralyzed their enemies. They swarmed over the exhausted, trapped knights, acting like wolves among a flock of armored sheep. The battle transformed instantly. It was no longer a clash of lines. It was a savage, one-sided slaughter. The horror at the front was magnified by the pressure from behind. The rear waves of the French army, blind to the catastrophe unfolding, continued to push forward, believing their comrades were breaking the English lines. This relentless pressure compressed the men at the front so brutally that many could not raise their arms to fight or defend themselves. They were crushed to death by the weight of their own army. The battle became a human meat grinder, a mound of bodies that grew in height, where men died suffocated beneath their countrymen. Panic seized the French ranks, but there was no escape. They were trapped in a prison of their own making. In the midst of the chaos, victory brought a new and terrible danger. French nobles, seeing the desperate situation, began to surrender in droves. Soon, the English had more prisoners than they could handle, outnumbering their own soldiers. At that critical moment, a small French detachment led by a local lord attacked the English baggage camp, creating an alarm in the rear. Fearing the prisoners might rearm and rejoin the fight, Henry V made one of the cruelest and most controversial decisions of the war. He ordered the execution of most of the captives. It was an act of brutal pragmatism, a dark stain on a legendary victory. but in the king's mind, it was a necessity to ensure his army's survival. The battle, as such, was over. What remained was a hunt. The French army, completely broken and demoralized, dissolved into a mob of terrified individuals trying to flee through the same mud that had condemned them. The English, now masters of the field, pursued and killed without mercy. When the last cry faded and silence returned to the valley, the scene was apocalyptic. The battlefield was not covered in bodies, it was built of them. In some areas, the dead and dying were piled as high as a man. The flower of French nobility lay dead or captive. The small, sick army of underdogs had not just survived, it had annihilated a giant. As the sun began to set over the field of Agincourt, the scale of the carnage became apparent in a cold, cruel light. The price paid by France was catastrophic, a generational bloodletting from which it would take decades to recover. The exact figures are debated by historians, but the most conservative estimates speak of between 7,000 and 10,000 French dead, with thousands more taken prisoner. Among the fallen was the very apex of the kingdom's military and political power, Constable Charles d'Albret, 3 dukes, 9 counts, and nearly 100 other great banneret lords. The French nobility had not simply been defeated, it had been decapitated in a single autumn afternoon. An entire generation of leadership was wiped from the map, leaving a power vacuum that would plunge France into even deeper civil war. In stark contrast, the cost to the victors was almost miraculously low. English chronicles, though likely understated, report incredibly small figures, perhaps as few as 100 dead, including notable figures like the Duke of York. Even the most pessimistic estimates rarely exceed 400 fallen. The casualty ratio was so lopsided, it seemed to defy all military logic, a brutal testament to the effectiveness of Henry's tactics and the lethality of his archers. For the English soldiers walking among the piles of bodies, stripping the dead, the feeling must have been surreal. They had entered the slaughterhouse as lambs and had emerged as wolves, having paid a minimal price for one of the most total victories in military history. The fate of the commanders mirrored the battle's outcome. While Charles d'Albret lay dead among his men, his body stripped of armor and dignity, Henry V stood as the undisputed master of the battlefield. He had gambled everything and won it all. The victory not only ensured his army's survival, but elevated him to legendary status. He was seen as a king blessed by God, a military genius whose audacity had been rewarded with a miracle. His leadership, once questioned for his youth, was now unassailable. The massacre of the prisoners, though brutal, was seen by many in his time as a harsh but necessary decision. Henry V had not just won a battle, he had forged a legend in mud and blood. The echo of Agincourt resonated far beyond the blood-soaked field, altering the course of the 100 Years' War and the balance of power in Europe. Politically, the victory was a masterstroke for Henry V. The annihilation of the French leadership exacerbated the internal divisions in a kingdom already fractured by the madness of its king, Charles VI. Capitalizing on this chaos, Henry V was able to launch a systematic campaign of conquest in Normandy, securing fortress after fortress. This momentum culminated in 1420 with the signing of the Treaty of Troyes, a humiliating document that disinherited the French Dauphin and named Henry V as regent and heir to the throne of France. For a brief, shining moment, the English dream of uniting the crowns of England and France seemed a tangible reality. Militarily, Agincourt represented the zenith of the longbow as the dominant weapon on the battlefields of Western Europe. The battle was the most brutal and definitive demonstration that a well-disciplined infantry, armed with powerful bows, could destroy the elite of feudal cavalry even in open country. The myth of the invincibility of the armored knight on horseback, already damaged in battles like Crécy and Poitiers, was finally shattered in the mud of Agincourt. The victory cemented the reputation of the English and Welsh archer as the most feared soldier of his time and forced continental powers to rethink their military doctrines, accelerating the transition towards armies more focused on infantry and, eventually, gunpowder weapons. However, the most enduring impact of Agincourt was not political or military, but cultural. The battle was almost immediately transformed into a foundational myth for English identity, the ultimate story of triumph against the odds. It became the supreme symbol of the tenacity, discipline, and indomitable spirit of the underdog. It was proof that the courage of common men could overcome the pride and power of the aristocracy. This narrative was captured and magnified by chroniclers and balladeers, but no one would immortalize it as powerfully as William Shakespeare. His play, Henry V, transformed a medieval king into a timeless national hero. The famous St. Crispin's Day speech, delivered by Henry before the battle in Shakespeare's play, became one of the most iconic monologues in English literature, a rallying cry that has inspired generations. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. For he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother. These words, though an invention of the playwright, captured the essence of the Agincourt legend, the idea that adversity forges bonds stronger than blood and that glory can be achieved by the humblest of men. Thanks to Shakespeare, Agincourt ceased to be merely a historical battle and became an eternal epic of courage, sacrifice, and brotherhood. The heroes of Agincourt did not wear gleaming armor or ride bedecked war horses. While the French nobility represented an ocean of polished steel, a symbol of wealth, power, and a world order based on lineage, the true architects of victory were common men. They were Welsh and English peasants and craftsmen, their faces weathered by the sun and covered in mud and sweat, not ornate visors. Their defense was not a plate of steel forged in Milan, but a padded jerkin sewn at home and, above all, a will of iron. They fought without helms, sometimes barefoot in the mire, and their appearance was the antithesis of the chivalry they faced. They were not the protagonists that legends usually choose, but on that day, they became the embodiment of human tenacity. Their main weapon was the great yew bow, the instrument that decimated the cavalry, but their immortal legend was forged the moment they abandoned it. When the arrows ran out, their hands did not wield swords forged for nobles, but the brutal tools of their everyday lives: woodmen's axes, blacksmiths' hammers, and long butchers' knives. With these raw and deadly weapons, they threw themselves into the fray like a pack of wolves, agile and fierce, against the steel giants trapped and helpless in the mud. It was the triumph of pragmatism over romanticism, of brutal effectiveness over martial pomp. It was these ordinary, sick-sar and mud-caked men who, with their own hands, dismantled the flower of French chivalry, leaving an eternal lesson etched in history.